Hi guys, welcome to another episode of Pointy Not Sharp. Today we're taking a look at this absolute monster of a bayonet here, the Austrian model 1870 Werndl bayonet. You'll see it barely even fits in frame, and it's actually a shortened version, so the original was even longer than this. Now, these were made to fit a number of different rifles. First off, they were designed for the model of 1867 Werndl rifle, which was a very sturdy and robust rifle, a black powder single-shot rifle, breech loader. And that rifle was updated in 1873. A newer version came out, so it's also made to fit the model of 1873. And the 67/77 and 73/77s, which were conversions to a new caliber, I believe it was. So those four rifles. There were a couple of other Werndl rifles that will not fit this bayonet, being the cavalry carbines and the extra core carbines. So these will only fit the long, full-length infantry rifles. Now, these bayonets were manufactured by, well, the company changed name mid-production. So from 1964 to 69, the company that manufactured these was Joseph and Franz Werndl and Kamp Waffenfabrik and this. Sorry guys, my Austrian is shocking. And then in 1969, they changed their name to OEWG, which is the crowd favourite, my personal favourite manufacturer of bayonets. And today we know them as Steyr. They changed their name again in 1912 to Steyr, which was the town in which the majority of their factories were operating. Now, the history of this bayonet is really quite interesting. And to be fair, it's not just the history of the bayonet, it's also the history of the rifle itself. So the US Civil War really sort of introduced breech-loading firearms, and they were starting to be introduced pretty much worldwide, and Austria realised it was time to start making them themselves. Before I continue on with that, actually, I should probably point out these were manufactured from 1867 to 1888, and there was about 1.11 million made, and considering how many were made, there's not many around today, so they're quite hard to find. I'd love to know where they've all gone. Hopefully there's a big cache somewhere, but probably not. Anyway, breech-loading rifles were all the craze. The Germans have been doing it for a little while with their Dracy rifles. The French were developing their Chassepot, and while they were both paper cartridge rifles or needle fire rifles, metallic cartridge rifles were certainly being developed everywhere. And that's what I think it was Joseph Werndl was designing with his rifle, which was a bit of a gamble that paid off enormously and really made his company. Now, the Werndl replaced the muzzle-loading Lorenz rifle, which was the model of 1854. Just as the Werndl was coming in, they were also updating the Lorenz rifles as a bit of a stopgap into a breech-loading rifle, which was the model of 1854/67 Werndl breech loader conversion. Some of those did use a yataghan style of bayonet, and that was actually the inspiration or the predecessor to what we have here, which was the Werndl bayonet with a yataghan style of blade. The yataghan's like a double recurve. Now, the first bayonet designed for the Werndl is not what we have here. It was the model of 1867, and that was a much longer and much heavier bayonet than what we have here. The blade was, how long was it again? It was 584 millimeters in length, which is very, very long. It was a thick blade, and the fuller wasn't terribly deep. The 1867 also had a bead above the muzzle ring instead of this adjustable screw. So that was a very, very large, very, very heavy bayonet to go on what was already an extremely large and heavy rifle. So there was a update in 1870 for a lighter bayonet and one with a screw above the muzzle ring. So the reason for this is, if you're familiar with the Chassepot bayonets, they weren't interchangeable from rifle to rifle, and it appears was a bit the same with the Werndl. While Joseph Werndl's whole company was based around interchangeable parts, bayonets still had to be adjusted to fit around an individual muzzle. So you got a screw to adjust these two pieces together and slightly change the diameter of the muzzle ring. So that was an issue they had with the model of 1867. Now the blade itself was also thinned down a little bit, and the fullers were deepened. Now this one here is a model of 1870, although as I said earlier, it has been shortened. I should also point out the 67 and 70 used a leaf spring, and they have a whole different range of push buttons, different shapes and sizes. This one's missing its push button, unfortunately, so I can't show you that. And the reason I tell you that before we get into construction is because it comes relevant with the model of 1873 bayonet. So, and the 1870, sorry, had a blade 575 millimeters in length. So still a very long blade, longer than what we have here. So by 1873, they developed a update to the rifle and made the rifle a lot lighter and more ergonomic. And they also decided to update the bayonet while they were there. So they did away with the leaf spring and they put in a coil spring button like your standard press button that you have on most modern bayonets, which were sort of creeping in around about that time. And they also shortened the blade. So the model of 1873 had a much shorter blade than what we have here. I think it was a 475 millimeter blade, which is more than 10 centimeters shorter than what the 67 and 70 were. The model of 1873 bayonet also came with a number of different styles of handles, and the style of handle was changed throughout production. I don't have the exact dates, so I can't tell you what year they would have roughly been based on the handle, but the first one had a composite handle like we have here. It looks like leather, but it's actually a composite, and it had 3 inline rivets. So that's how you spot the first one. And they were steel rivets. The second type had a wooden handle and had 3 really large diameter brass rivets. And third kind was also wood and just had 2 steel rivets. And I believe those were introduced in 1981, but I don't know about the other 2 types. And when the model 1873, this is 70, was introduced, the 67s and 70s were shortened in line with the 73. And that's what we do have here. So the model 67s were shortened down to 472 millimeters from 584, and that's the length of the blade. And the 70s were shortened down to 475 from 575. And from what I can tell, with our Werndl bayonets, it's not really an exact science when it comes to the length of the bayonet. When they shorten them, there are a little bit of variations. But for the most part, they're also sitting around that 475 millimeter, some a little bit over, some a little bit under. Now, these bayonets were in service for quite some time, from 1867 through until the 1920s. And in 1888, quite a few of them, or from 1888 onwards, quite a few of them were modified and adapted to fit the model of 1888 rifle. And the way you spot these modifications, or these bayonets, is actually quite simple, is they'll have a cutout on the top of the pommel. And often, they'll have an insert in the muzzle ring to accommodate a much smaller muzzle of the model of 1888 rifle, which I believe was a smokeless powder rifle. And when looking at these bayonets, you'll notice that this one has a ring on the pommel. Not all of them have these. This is actually the mark of an NCO version. So what they'll do is they'll hang a trottle or puppety, which is like a cloth knot, through this ring and wrap it around the quillen, and that's the mark of an NCO. And this carried on through with the M95 bayonets in the First World War as well. I mean, hell, the Germans were still doing it in the Second World War. So the NCO ones are a lot harder to find than the regulars, but pretty much all Werndl bayonets are getting very difficult to find, especially in good condition and especially with the scabbards. This one doesn't have the scabbard, and a bit devastated about that. It doesn't have the push button either, but I got it for a good price, so I'm very happy with it. Now, I stated earlier that the Yataghan style of blade was carried on from the Lorenz rifle. I don't have a photo of that particular bayonet that was the predecessor to this one. In fact, they are extremely rare. So you might have to use your imagination, but I can't imagine it's terribly different to what we have here. I don't know what the handle construction was. I imagine possibly brass, because that's generally what most bayonet handles were like from the early 60s and before. If you're not familiar with Yatagan style of blades, you haven't seen my other videos, there's two schools of thought as to why they're in place. The first is that the recurve, the curved blade, offers a better cutting coefficient. And the second was that with muzzle loading firearms, even though this was a breech loader, it was an extra layer of safety. So when you're holding the muzzle and you're reloading and you're ramming with your ramrod, you don't want to stab your hand with the bayonet. So the yataghan offsets the blade away from the hand of the shooter and puts a little bit of a buffer in there. Now, being a breech loading firearm, this is not really relevant to the Werndl, but it was a very popular style and sort of carried on for a couple of years anyway. Now, I said earlier, these bayonets were in service all the way through until I think it was 1921 when they were finally taken out of service. And yes, they did actually see service in World War I, and more than that, they saw frontline service. So initially, they were issued to rear echelon soldiers or rear echelon battalions, but as the war went on, a couple of these units did go to the front, and there were cases where battalions of soldiers armed with these bayonets and the Werndl single-shot black powder rifles were fighting on the front line. I'm not sure I'd want to use that kind of rifle on the front line myself, but beggars can't be choosers, and that's exactly what they had. Now we'll jump into the construction of the bayonet itself. So we have a nice high carbon steel blade, quite long as you can see. We've got a slight false edge, unsharpened, and a true edge which was once sharpened but is now quite dull with age. We have a nice big square fuller on either side of the blade and a slightly rounded spine. And it should be noted there is no script on the top of the spine. I don't believe any of the Werndl rifles had script on there. Correct me if I'm wrong. The French bayonets, being the Chassepot and the Gras, certainly did. The Portuguese model of 1885, which was very similar to this bayonet, shared the same blade profile, was made in the same factory, did have script up there, and a lot of the Steyr-made bayonets did, but they were all for export. The Werndls themselves for Austrian service, as far as I can tell, did not have that marking. Moving down to our crossguard, we have a flattened hook quillen. It's a very unique shape. You'll only find that shape on the Austrian Werndls. And then we have our muzzle ring, and as I previously stated, we have our screw, or our adjustment screw. Take a look at that, and as you can see, you need a specialized tool to adjust that, so that would be done probably at unit armorer level. Then we have a bit of a concave recess running down the spine of the handle here, as you can see, to accommodate the barrel. It's almost like a lengthened muzzle ring. It feels really, really nice, quite like that. Then our grips, while they look leather, are composite, and they're really, really nice little grips. And as you can see here, the grips are retained by 4 rivets, and on the other side we have 3 rivets with 1 screw holding in the leaf spring, and you'll see that screw does not align with that rivet. I don't know what the handle looks like underneath here. I haven't seen any photos, and I'm not taking this off. We have a nice big classically shaped Austrian pommel, the same as what you see on your Portuguese model of 1885s, which is one of my all-time favourites. And a really, if I get that camera, really big mortise, as you can see here. And as previously stated, we've got our NCO ring on the base of the pommel. So usually you'd have a really big press button here, and there are quite a few styles. There's big domed mushroom ones, there's like raised T styles, but I don't have one of those to show you. Now, while I don't have a Werndl scabbard to show you, I do have a Portuguese model of 1885, and these are pretty much identical to what the Werndl rifles take. They're just slightly smaller. So as you can see, it's steel construction. with a ball finale and no drainage hole down the end. And then we have a Austrian style of frog stud and a single direction throat. So it'll only go in one way with the spine at the top. And just like this one, the Werndls are retained by 2 rivets. And this one here says OEWG, which is the same as what you find on the Werndl scabbards. So I checked off camera. The bayonet doesn't fit in here, so I can't show you, but they're pretty much identical. And finally, we'll cover off the markings of this bayonet, and there are quite a few. Now, I really struggled researching the markings of this because there's some quite tricky ones, but we'll start off nice and simple. So first off, we have our OEWG. That is our manufacturer mark. That's an easy one. And then just above that, up here, very faint marking. I can't make it out what it is, but there was a faint, sort of like a oval with some numbers or letters in it. And I've had no success figuring out what that is. It could be an inspection or a proof mark. I've no idea. You know, it could be anything. Then to the left, we have a Z. And the Z stands for Lorenz Ziegler Vienna. And as far as I can tell, that's like a inspection mark carried out in Lorenz or Zettler, if that's a place. Now, moving around to the other side, on our quillins, this is where you'll find your unit marks. Now, I've had no luck deciphering what this unit mark is. I've got like a triple lined box on the left with an L next to it with a full stop. And then the other side I have a capital S, lowercase t, full stop, capital B, full stop, and then a line. Underneath the line I've got 4392. I imagine 4392 would be the individual weapon number. STB might be the type of battalion. I had someone tell me it could be Stormtrooper Battalion, which I find highly unlikely because as far as I know there weren't Stormtrooper battalions prior to World War One. And in the First World War they would not be issued with a Werndl rifle and bayonet. That seems ridiculous. The L, I have no idea, and that little box, I've had no luck whatsoever figuring out what that is. So it's a bit of a mystery. Now the other markings we have on the base of the pommel, down here, if I can get that on camera, my lighting's not great. You can't really make it out too well, but I've got a couple of numbers down the base of the pommel. And from what I've read, those are World War I serial numbers or rack numbers. So this is a bayonet that would have seen service during the First World War. And finally, the only other marking I have is a couple of digits down the tang. So I've got a 1 up here and 2, 3 down here. These could be inspection marks. These could be manufacturing marks. I don't know. At first I got excited thinking they might be year of manufacture, like, you know, January 73, but that's a 2, not a 7. So I don't know what those are. I also think there's another marking here on the side of the pommel, like a number that's worn off, but I can't make out what that is. I can only see like a faint shadow of it. But those are all the markings you'll find on these, and as I said, on the scabbards you'll also have your manufacturer's mark and possibly a unit mark as well. But yeah, I can't show you that. I don't have the scabbard. Anyway guys, this was a really fun video to make. There was a lot of research and a lot of reading that went into this one because it's quite difficult to find good sources of information on these. Surprisingly, the best source of information I found was another video on YouTube, which was done by C&R Arsenal by Matthias. So that was a fantastic resource there. He had like a 1 hour, 15-minute video. It's fantastic. Highly recommend you watch that. Anyway, guys, if you enjoy this kind of content, please subscribe. Plenty more coming, and thanks for watching.